So let's talk tactics of the Orky variety, with one of the single most fun Grotmas detachments yet. It seems Flashgits, Shooter Boys, Stormboyz and Commandos have learned some tricks from the Imperial Guard, as they basically get orders. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Orks, and in this video I thought we'd take a look at their Taktikal Brigade, an Orky force with a surprising amount of cunning. As ever, we're continuing with the Grotmas detachments once again here. It's a fully legal detachment for Warhammer 40k match play, ready to play immediately with points cost for the enhancements and everything like that right here in the document, and available on the app in January. Day 14 was for the Orks, there was Saturday's drop, then we had Guard on Sunday. I'm just catching up with the Orky video now, but it seems like we'll be back in not too very long to talk about Chaos Demons as well, which will be the content for Monday. That's going to be a rather enormous one, as there's 4 detachments, not 1. For current Orks in Warhammer 40k, they're maybe not doing too bad right now. They were having some issues after they got nerfed kind of heavily after their initial strong codex, but after a few judicious points decreases, Games Workshop have them on a far more even kill. Win rates are around about 47% prior to the last recent balance update, and at least a fairly good track of some actual good tournament wins with that, even if they're maybe just very slightly below average for the average player on the win percentage, though hardly by very much and very close to 50%. For detachments, they still mainly use the Warhorde. Extra melee damage is hard to go too far wrong with, and they have some nice charge boosting and damage and defensive stratagems. But the majority of the rest of the Codex detachments are at least somewhat playable. Bully Boys, Dread Mob and Green Tide are all also doing at least okay for some people, making them work, even if a couple of the detachments were kind of suffering. In the recent balance updates, they buffed the War, and calling that in the command phase is really quite helpful so you don't have to broadcast when you're doing it to your opponent. Otherwise, there were some small but bearable points increases for the War Boss and Mega Armored Boss, and they had a good go at making the Big Hunt a bit better. Being able to target characters to be the prey target I think will be a very nice boost for that, though they didn't do anything for the Speed Freaks and Buggies unfortunately. Maybe next time for them. I feel like the Orky Grotmas detachment was perhaps one of the ones that a lot of people were interested to see. I feel like Orks are one of the armies in Warhammer 40k that have the most strong archetypes in them, and there were at least a few options that the Codex didn't really cover too well. I feel like shooting Orks for more on foot boys was maybe one of the things highest on the wish list, maybe featuring either Bad Moons or Freebooters units. A sneaky Ork detachment for Blood Axes wouldn't have gone amiss, and I feel like they could have done a transport style one like maybe Blitz Brigade in the past, focusing around battle wagons maybe. I feel like they could have gone for all sorts of other wild and wonderful ones beyond that, but they had quite a lot to choose from. In the end, what they wound up going for I think was really quite interesting. The detachment we've gone for is the Taktikal Brigade, one that's kind of overtly Blood Axe themed, with sneaky Orks, Stormboyz and Commandos, but interestingly they've also seemed to manage to do it quite well, so this really wouldn't be all that bad for Bad Moons and Freebooters, as it seems like it's one of the strongest places to run Shooter Boys and Flashgits, being able to hit things a lot better. For the overt theme though, the Blood Axe one is really quite fun. Blood Axes and Commandos love their tactics, unusually regimented formations of Stormboyz, Orks wearing camouflage all over the place, and engaging in some low cunning tactics, feigned retreats, flanking the enemy and not just charging into battle howling, and this has often been known to confound Imperial generals in the past, underestimating a foe that usually behaves in the simple charge and kill you kind of way most of the time, but if you happen to be fighting Blood Axe Orks they might operate very differently indeed. In the past, they've been realised by doing things like getting cover or being able to fall back and charge. So I think the rules that they wrote for this one are really quite fun and a bit more creative than the average Grotmas detachment. Basically, the main core rule for this is Orky Orders, essentially stealing it from the Astra Militarum with a fairly similar system. I feel like a lot of the rule names in this are pretty epic. The rule's called Listen Here. Boss Nikrot, Mechs, and Warboss models can all issue 1 or 2 tactics to any one Orky unit within 6 inches. So similar sort of rules to the voice of command for the Astra Militarum, and you can either do so in the command phase or when they're set up on the board in the movement phase, say if they've come out of reserves or got out of a transport. Unlike the guard orders, you can issue 2 of these tactics to 1 unit if you want to, but if you decide to double down on the buffs, the unit has to take a leadership test, and if it's failed then you take D3 mortal wounds. Maybe not so very different from the Chaos Space Marine Dark Pacts in a way. I feel like sometimes it might make sense to risk that, sometimes it might not, but definitely very fun and freeing to have the option if there's a big unit that you definitely want 2 buffs on. Those keywords are quite flexible as well. The Warboss one means that really quite a lot of models in the HQ section can issue those, including things like Beast Bosses or Deathkiller War Tracks, and the same with the Mechs and all their variants. As with the Guard orders, you can't do these to undisciplined people who have fallen to Battle Shock, and if a unit becomes Battle Shock, then their Orky tactics are immediately cancelled. I guess disruption happens a bit too much in the ranks. For the tactics themselves, you've got 4 different options. They're generally quite infantry and mounted unit focused, and I feel like the other 2 that aren't locked to them are kind of better on more squad sort of units as opposed to big stompy vehicles. Again, pretty fun naming on these as well. Very nice that you can deploy the Orky rule called Listen Ear and then just tell your squad to get on with it. In any case, going through the list, first up we have Get Stuck In, which is reroll charge rolls. I feel like if you don't think that the others are going to have massive advantages, that one's often going to be good if they are making a charge. Just a bit more reliable with getting in. It could be nice out of deep strike perhaps, or if they've been set up with a weird boy. I could save you command points if you need to reroll. The next one, Get On With It, is a +1 strength to melee weapons. That's pretty general purpose and quite good for a bunch of units. Very nice in the war turn as well, as you get +1 strength and +1 attack there. So that would be +2 strength in total if you issue this. It means in the turn of the war you could have regular boys getting all the way up to strength 6 or strength 12 for a war boss with a power claw. Or regular knobs even in a turn that you don't have the war going off will be strength 10, and that's quite a nice breakpoint for power claws as well. This one does seem very helpful, though it's going to depend on what exactly you're charging. A lot of the time in 40k, +1 strength doesn't necessarily equate to +1 to wounds. Then we've got a counter range one called Sneaky Stalking. This one's for infantry or mounted models that aren't mega knobs, and they gain both the stealth keyword and also the benefit of cover against ranged attacks. That's pretty nice, basically having almost the equivalent of free smoke, but applying to infantry and mounted units instead. It's not going to do you any good if your opponent's planning to charge you and chop you up there. But if you're playing against a gun line, that's pretty massive as a durability increase. Even if some of your squad isn't in cover, you're all getting a cover save, and -1 to hit is a nice debuff too. It definitely feels like standard Ork boys would be a lot harder to take down if they're slogging up the board with that on the go. And feels like it'd be quite a good one for Squighog boys as well, which do have some big chunky defensive profiles at the best of times, and even better if they've got cover and -1 to hit as well. I feel like if your unit's going to take some significant enemy fire, it could well be worth risking the D3 mortal wounds to have this as well as whatever else you wanted. Finally, we've got shooter drills, which is an infantry or mounted option. When that unit makes a ranged attack, then you get +1 to hit. So if you're hitting on a 5, you'd be hitting on a 4, and if you'd be hitting on a 4, you'd go to a 3. +1 to hit often tends to be kind of massive for Orks, given the jump between hitting on 5s and 4s is such a big one. But unfortunately, due to modifiers, it doesn't really stack super well on a few units, so say tank busters already get a +1 to hit if they're shooting against vehicles, so it won't usually matter for them unless they're trying to attack elite infantry. And if you had either looters or flash kits stationary for a turn, then it wouldn't double stack with the heavy keyword, but I think it still will be really relevant on them, given that they'll often be having to move to, say, jump out of transports or get line of sight on things. I feel like flash kits perhaps seem like the single best target for it, being able to move around and going to hitting on a 4+. They're already used in competitive lists as a fairly good shooting and then charge unit with a bunch of chopper attacks. So it could be quite nice piling outside of a transport alongside, say, a war boss and some knobs. And while they don't have normal leaders that can join them, there's one enhancement that allows a mech to join the unit and buff them further, which seems kind of auto-include in this. Otherwise, tank busters and looters definitely feel like they could make good use of that, and seems like one of the best ways to run shooter boys as well, getting all that DACA on a 4+. In general though, I feel like this is a pretty strong set of rules. The +1 strength could often be relevant, stealth and cover is going to be pretty helpful for a bunch of units trying to survive, and the +1 to hit at range is great for certain units, though it's maybe going to be a little bit specific. Definitely feels like a rule that adds a fair bit of value. Finally, for the core rules, there's also one to be able to field Stormboyz as battle line. So that means that you could have 4 units or more of them if you wanted, though I feel like that actually depends on whether or not you really want to spam that many of them. I feel like the sweet spot for a lot of other Orky lists maybe tends to be like 1 or 2 units of them to jump around doing secondaries and a bit of skirmishing. At the current points cost, they're just not really seen as being all that effective as a sort of damage dealer unit compared with things like boys jumping out of transports. In this detachment specifically though, I feel like you could go a bit heavier on them, as there's a couple of stratagems that support them quite well, though it's maybe a little bit disappointing that they're not going to be super easy to order about, given that they don't have leaders that can attach alongside them with the removal of boss Zagstruck in the codex. If you did want to go crazy on them though, it's kind of a fun idea to think of 60 of them just bounding up the board and charging the enemy super fast. I'm sure there's some Ork collectors out there who have plenty of Stormboyz. You were able to fill them in mobs of 30 in the past. Beyond just spamming them though, the battle line thing could be kind of handy for the secret mission to try and get a battle line unit into the enemy deployment zone, particularly as they have a return to reserve style stratagem. So you might be able to drop them in the backfield and get some points that way. Before we jump into the units and stratagems, I'll give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in the Ork Monuments from Printology Labs, which could be one fun option if you want to put some greenskin terrain on the table and you live in the USA. They'll be linked down in the video description. Basically, these are a bunch of big cool centerpiece 3D printed pieces, essentially trying to look like a great ruined Orky statue, giving me the same sort of vibes as, say, Planet of the Apes type things, or the great big ruined statues from previous ages in the Lord of the Rings. You can see the size of them compared with the Space Marines for scale here. There's things like an Orky Power Claw piece, a great big fallen head, Statue of Liberty style, and a massive stick bomb. Plus an Orky Pharaoh head type piece, an enormous chopper in the same sort of style as the others, and a great big centerpiece worn in Orc Mount Rushmore. In any case, if you want some greenskin terrain goodness, then feel free to check them out, links down in the video description. They have the pieces individually and also a big combined set at a small discount. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video. Before we jump into the stratagems, I thought I'd just quickly talk through the three most key units perhaps. Stormboyz are 65 points per 5 or 130 per 10, basic Orc boys stats, but they get deep strike and advance and charge and fall back and charge all the time. As mentioned, often used in units of 5 to drop down and do secondaries and things, though in the turn of the war they can certainly turn on the damage against lighter infantry if they need to. Flash kits are a pretty scary unit, as again is fairly often running competitive. They get 3 attacks at strength 6 AP1 damage 2 with sustained hits, going to 4 if they shoot the closest thing, and once per game lethal hits as well. It just means they're quite good at mauling sort of medium to lighter infantry. Their shooting can stack a fair bit of damage on most things with their turn of lethal hits, and then they can still charge with a whole bunch of choppers as well. They're certainly scary enough in close combat when they need to be. Finally, for the other Blood Axii type unit, we've got the Commandos. They're 120 points for the Orky Infiltrators, basically paying a bit of a premium to start in the mid-board, and then they can't be overwatched. They get the stealth keyword, a couple of fun bits of kit like breach rams, a bomb squig and a distraction grot, but maybe feel like a force that you often use for board control. Perhaps a little bit more so than their damage and defense, given that you paid the premium for infiltrate. Getting into the stratagems that can affect them though for the Taktikal Brigade. First up, we've got 1 command point for Datasheets. This one you can only use on Orcs that are within engagement range. You trigger it in the command phase, either yours or your opponent's, and they get +1 OC until the next command phase. Basically, this one's just kind of an auto-use one if it's going to make the difference between it scoring an objective or denying victory points to your opponent. I feel like the stipulation to also be in melee maybe does mean it could be a tiny bit more niche. I think it will come up from time to time though. Next up, we've got quite a nice damage one called Fight Proper, basically representing Blood Axes actually doing a bit of close combat drill rather than just doing what comes naturally. And it gives an infantry or mounted unit either sustained or lethal hits in melee. That one definitely seems like it could be nice enough on all manner of big fighty Orc units. Sustained hits is usually an extra 25% damage, maybe a bit more if you're hitting on a 4+ natively. And that one could perhaps be particularly interesting on Ghazghkull during the turn of the war, given that he gives you 5+ criticals. It's nice to be able to flex into a bit more damage on your biggest, scariest units fighting hard. I feel like lethals are another really interesting one though. Usually that equates to around about a 50% damage increase if you're wounding an enemy unit on a 5+, which is more powerful against those kind of targets. Seems great for a unit like Knobs with Power Claws, going into something like a Toughness 11 or 12 vehicle, or if you were charging in with a whole bunch of boys with choppers and having far more impact on your target than you would have otherwise. That one seems like quite a good one to me, really quite easy to use and lots of good targets. Next up, we've got a Stormboy one called Crunch in Descent. This one gives Stormboyz kind of Hammer of Wrath impact hits. When you end a charge move for each Stormboy model that's within engagement range, you roll a dice and on a 4+ you deal a mortal wound up to a maximum of 6. This one potentially could be really quite scary if, say, you had a big squad of Stormboyz and you managed to get literally every one of them into an engagement range, then in theory land that'd be 5 mortal wounds on average, which is easily good enough. In reality though, due to the size and shape of units and when you actually charge, you might often be fighting in 2 ranks, and all the ones in the second rank won't actually be in engagement range, so you might only get half the squad. For a 5 model squad, even if you manage to get all of them in, it's going to be a bit lower yield than using the grenade stratagem if that's equally convenient. Though I guess the existence of this one does give you a chance to just be that bit more threatening with those cheap objective skirmishing Stormboy squads, and might give you a little bit of a nudge that you might want to take a 10-man one, at least a bit more so here versus anywhere else. I wouldn't say it's the most general purpose stratagem of them all though. Next up, for 1 command point, we've got Onto the Next. That one gives you a move after the enemy's fallen back from you, and if your opponent drops back you get to do a normal move of 6 inches. I guess in theory you could try and think ahead a little bit. If your units can fight effectively and still manage to end combat somewhere near ruins and things, you might well be able to jump out, hit something, and then when the enemy drops back, if there's any left of them, you could hide. Or it could just be handy to have them move away from any enemies running on to try and charge you. Though I feel like if you've just been doing charging and being locked up, you're probably fairly far forward. I feel like this is one of the ones that from time to time could be really quite big, but also a lot of the time it isn't really going to be an option that really changes loads of things unless the opponent just doesn't really see it coming and it's a bit of a gotcha. Next up, for one command point, we've got Dead Sneaky. This one allows commandos or Stormboyz to return to strategic reserves at the end of the turn if they're not in engagement range, so go off the board to come back in a later round. This one seems best on small squads of Stormboyz going after secondary objectives, being able to bring them down and then send them back up into the sky to try and do something else useful later in the game seems good, essentially giving you some reserves on turn 4 and 5 if needed, and as mentioned could be interesting seeing as their battle line to do the secret mission. I feel like commandos feel like a little bit less valuable to do that with, just because the squad's kind of expensive at 120 points, and as they won't be able to deep strike, they'll be coming in from the board edges, so don't have as many options. Definitely a good one though, always nice to have some redeploy stuff. Finally, for one command point, we've got Tactical Retreat. This one gives you fallback, shoot and charge, and that's just a very helpful support stratagem for basically any army in the game. It's not locked to any unit keywords, and I guess feels kind of Blood Axe with feigned retreats and then charging somewhere different. Really good for units that you might want to move out and then charge back in somewhere else, but also very good at ensuring shooting isn't just going to get ruined. Say for example some flash gets here. It means that if you do have a big scary squad of them, which you probably will in this one, if you invest a command point, you know that you're still going to be able to shoot with them. Overall, I feel like there's some stronger and weaker ones here. I feel like fallback, shoot and charge, the return to reserve for 5-man Stormboyz, and the sustained and lethal hits in melee are maybe the best ones, the other ones perhaps a little bit more niche or situational. Finally though, we get to the enhancements. The first one is Squad Leader for 15 points. This one allows a war boss to lead commandos and also gain stealth and infiltrate if it's doing so. This one isn't just the basic war boss datasheet as well, even if it seems likely that they probably meant to make it the base war boss datasheet. Given it's the keyword, it means that you could do weird things like attach a Deathkiller War Trike or a big beast boss on a Squigosaur to the unit, and maybe have them at the very front of the army to be able to do some charging or something straight away. Though I'm not sure you're really gaining all that much by using that sort of tactic. I think despite the weird options that you could do it with, it's probably still nicer just with the standard cheap war boss. 75 points for a +1 to hit for those commandos, and a massive amount of fight if you happen to be calling the war when there's still a good amount of them intact. That could be pretty fun. I feel like the enhancement would be a bit more interesting if it actually gave a further buff when he's leading them though. Next up though, we have the really big one, which is Mech Captain. This is 35 points for a big mech to be able to join flash kits, and when he joins them he allows them to reroll hits at range. Big mechs generally have the ability to reroll hit rolls of 1 for their unit, so this makes it far better. This one's a lot of points, but they seem absolutely worth it. You make a unit that's just really scary looking. As mentioned, the flash kits already love the +1 to hit for shooting, and this gives them a character in their units that can give them that, so they'd be hitting on a 4+ to hit on the move with sustained hits. And the same buffs would be applying to the shock attack gun as well, so you're still going to be getting the +1 to hit and reroll all hits to that on the move. The flash kits have a once per game lethal hits as well, which makes them even more general purpose, and they're pretty easy to deliver as well, jumping out of a truck or another transport, and you can still use the detachment rule to do the orders then. On top of that, you'll be able to safeguard their firepower. If they get tagged in combat or even do some charging themselves, they can drop back and shoot still, and then even go on to charge back in with choppers. And also compare with other units out there, they're just staggeringly dangerous on Overwatch. In theory 30 shots, maybe up to 40 plus the big mech, hitting on 6s with inbuilt sustained hits, and then reroll everything that isn't a 6. And that basically means that you'll be getting something like 20 odd hits at strength 6 damage 2 even on Overwatch. I feel like this one is almost the spiritual successor to Captain Badrock. I feel like you could just proxy him as say a big mech with shock attack gun or even just the regular big mech, and just have a ludicrously dangerous single unit of flash kits. I think that probably is the best use for that enhancement, just as it looks so scary, but alternatively you could potentially put the big mech in a unit of tank busters or mech guns or looters or something, and he'd still give them full rerolls to hit unrestricted, as it doesn't actually seem to be tied to him joining flash kits. I feel like none of those are really quite as strong though, and looters might be able to get full rerolls to hit anyway if they target something or an objective. But in any case, in an optimised list, I feel like I'd be very tempted to take the full flash kit unit with the big mech and just absolutely lay waste to things in the shooting phase. Finally, for the enhancements, we've got Mork's Cunning for 15 points. That one's a redeployment type one. Redeploy 3 Orc units and you can put them into strategic reserves if it makes sense to. I feel like that could be big enough on certain things like kill rigs or battle wagons maybe, perhaps trying to nudge them around so they don't have lines of sight drawn to them. I feel like commandos would be another interesting target for it. You could potentially have them screen one big section of the board from infiltrators and then pull them back to one ruin or something. once you've seen the lie of the land and where the opponents put their forces. Finally, we've got God Boomer for 10 points. That one allows you to basically broadcast orders with your mech or your war boss, issuing them to infantry or mounted units up to 18 inches away as opposed to 6. I feel like that could be nice enough if you had some things advancing into the midfield without a character support. I guess maybe other units of flash kits or something, though it does mean that that individual unit wouldn't be getting orders themselves. Overall though, I do think that this one's really quite a fun one. Just the idea of Orky orders and the implementation of that I thought was really fun. And it does seem both powerful and impactful as well, potentially getting +1 strength and reroll charges. It's really quite a big boost, and you could stack that on the war. The range damage one seems very nice for certain units, and cover and stealth is pretty good. I think that that'd be quite a nice option for a big 20 strong unit of boys, maybe slogging into the midfield and being a pain to deal with. I feel like you definitely want some Stormboyz, maybe a few small units of them, and you'd have the option to return them to reserve for jumping around doing secondaries. That big mech and flash kits combo seems like a bit of a no-brainer. Just ridiculous amounts of shooting, and then pretty ridiculous amounts of overwatch after that as well. You could definitely have some other big mechs as well, perhaps with looters, making them hit on a 5+. 4-back shoot and charge is good for all sorts of support. 1 unit of commandos with that infiltrate redeploy I think is pretty nice to be able to deny the midfield with. And the sustained and lethal hits in melee I think will be a staple as well, being able to turn on a little bit of extra damage exactly where you need it. Overall I think they've done this one really quite well. Maybe a few of the stratagems aren't quite as good as some of the rest, but it seems that they've done a really good job of both having this appeal to Blood Axe players and also being useful for Bad Moon and freebooter shooting as well. Scary flash kits running around and potentially shooter boys hitting on 4s if you want them, between the 4+ to hit, and getting cover on those. It does feel like shooter boys would be far more effective here than elsewhere. I feel like it's probably not quite enough here to have it out-competing the raw power of Warhorde, though I think it's going to be interesting enough that people will play it and do well with it. It maybe does suffer a little bit from Stormboyz and Commandos not really being mainline damage dealers, just because they have points cost for their utility. It definitely looks good though. I'm sure there'll be plenty of people keen to play this one. Feels like there's a whole bunch of interesting things that you can do with it, and using the order system in very different ways on different units. In any case, let me know what you think down in the comments. What do you make of the Orky tactics? Do you think it looks fun? Do you think it looks strong? And are there any other combos that you'd be tempted to run yourself? If you'd like to check out the recent guard video as well as the rest of the Grotmas playlist, I'll leave that links down in the video description as well. Otherwise, feel free to check out the Orky monuments, links down in the video description. Thank you to Printology for sponsoring this one. Otherwise, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I do tend to have new 40k videos coming out just about every day. Finally, if you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. You can find that linked in the video description down below. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early from time to time, occasional votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.